Welcome to Kung Fu Podcast number 134, Part 2 of the biography of Sun Lu Tang. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what Kung Fu Podcast is all about, and I'm your host, Pt2 Smith. I really do appreciate you joining me today, this being Independence Day here in the U.S. And in fact, just less than an hour or so ago, I finished doing the fourth day of the 11-day meditational challenge. Is that free program I put together to help folks resurrect or begin a meditational program. And today's theme was all about emotional independence, which is something that we must learn to develop through your martial arts training. Whether it's ever mentioned to you or not, you have to develop this ability to look at criticism and opinions and learn how to turn them into something that you can use. You're not trying to be someone else. You're trying to take the best lessons you can get and make them work for you. And that is a big marker in emotional independence. If this is your first time to Kung Fu Podcast, welcome. This program was designed for the martial arts practitioners, whether you were a teacher or not, whether you were here in the U.S. or out in some of our followers over in Australia and other countries, and whether you have a good dojo or a kwoon, or whether you're practicing out in your backyard. If you have a purpose in learning the martial arts and you're trying to find a better way for yourself, it is part of my promise to try to do the best I can to present to you information, whether it's like today's program, which is a biography of a man who influenced martial arts, in such a way that whether you practiced his style of martial arts or even followed his philosophy, guess what? It didn't matter. You were going to have to deal with it in some shape, form, or fashion. And in many cases, it didn't matter if you were practicing the Chinese martial arts or in karate or other styles. There became this presence of blending of medicalization, philosophy, longevity, blended into the martial arts in different levels at different places, but it is still something that's part of the programs today. In this particular episode, we're going to look at the three sections of this biography. One is going to include his first encounter with the martial arts, his rough childhood, and a suicide attempt. We're going to take a broad look at men who transformed his life and how he came to die in the same room of the same house that he was born in. So if you're getting ready to take me for a walk, let's get going. If you're getting ready for your practice, I'm ready too. In the end of part one with Sun Lu Tang, we had left it in this place where Ben had stated, for the martial arts to succeed in the 20th century, they were going to need to transition. They had to be made appealing to increasingly educated and modern middle-class individuals living in urban areas. This group of people is going to be radically different than the people who had been learning martial arts well before the 20th century. And don't forget, this was happening in Japan at nearly the exact same time. Sun Lu Tang is an important figure in the early 20th century of Chinese martial arts. So now, you and I are going to move into part two, where Ben states, through his groundbreaking publications in the 1910s and 20s, Sun Lu Tang codified a set of ideas about the nature of the Chinese martial arts that we continue to carry with us. Ben also states that he is hesitant to write on Sun Lu Tang because he doesn't practice Sun-style Tai Chi, Xingyi, or Bakwa. Ben also states, for that matter, he's not particularly sympathetic to the view that Chinese martial arts should be about health and self-cultivation. He is much more familiar with the local histories of southern China and Cantonese culture, so his questions come from the viewpoint of an outsider. Ben states, the influence of Sun Lu Tang's ideas and reforms have stretched far beyond his homeland in the Central Plains. Sun's theories continue to influence popular perceptions in both the East and West about what the Chinese martial arts are and what they should be. With his triple dedication to hand combat, Taoist longevity, and classical Chinese philosophy, he has become the perfect little old Chinese man that all martial arts teachers are subsequently judged against. In short, it is necessary for the field of Chinese martial arts studies to address the contributions of this dynamic writer and thinker on a more fundamental level than any specific contributions that he may have made to popular lineages of Tai Chi or Xingyi Quan. So as we look at these three contributions, we're going to break them up into three sections. The first one is a brief discussion of Sun Lutang and his contributions to the traditional martial arts. You'll also get an overview and a timeline of his life. The information in this review is based on the introductionary essay by Tim Cartmel of 2003 titled A Study of Tai Chi Quan, 1921 by Sun Lutang. Cartmel drew on a variety of sources when assembling his biographical sketch, including extensive interviews with Sun Lutang's surviving daughter, Sun Jin Yun. She is a skilled martial arts teacher who worked with her father, and she was also able to fill in many of the gaps and paint a more accurate picture of her father's day-to-day life. The second section that we're going to cover will focus on Sun Lutang's association with other martial artists and hand combat institutions. In fact, one of the most interesting elements of Sun Lutang's life is the window that it opens onto the transformation of late Qing hand combat traditions and the development of modern martial arts culture in northern China. While the brief biographical sketches that will be presented cannot always flesh out the social importance of events in his life, it is the hope to be able to expand on some of this material in the second part. And then part 3. With a better understanding of the factual and social foundations of Sun Lutang's life, the third section will turn to a discussion of his lasting impact on the traditional Chinese martial arts. While Sun Lutang lived most of his life in northern China, his ideas have spread around the country and even around the globe. What impact did his synthesis of philosophy, medicine, and hand combat have on the development of the southern Chinese martial arts? To what extent did he provide the intellectual and philosophical foundations that allowed the Chinese martial arts to become a middle-class phenomenon, outgrowing in a large part their origins in a rural poverty? Will we be able to see his hand in the emergence of the Qigong craze of the 1990s and the subsequent medicalization of the Chinese martial arts? And then lastly, when we deal with students who want to say that Wing Chun is really an internal art, to what extent are they responding to ideas and hierarchies that were first developed by Sun and then promoted by his students? Well, let's take a further look. Kennedy and Gao have called Sun Lutang the most important Chinese martial artist of the modern era. And Ben says he doesn't think that assertion is an overstatement. Of course, saying that someone has had a huge impact on the development of something is not the same as saying that they were the most talented practitioner to ever live. If nothing else, Sun's books have clearly had a transformative impact on all the literature that has come after them. Yet and still, it seems that relatively few modern martial artists outside the Neijia community really have had much of an idea of who Sun actually was or what he accomplished. He is lionized by members of the Tai Chi lineage and ignored by pretty much everybody else. This review of Sun Lutang's life will have little to say about his specific martial arts teachings or contributions to Tai Chi. Instead, we're going to develop a broader appreciation of this historical figure in the field of Chinese martial studies. Sun Lutang's life is a fascinating case study that illustrates a key era in the transition of the Chinese martial arts. Furthermore, the ideas that he authored or popularized continue to shape how many people approach these fighting styles to this day. Even the practice of people who will profess to have never studied Sun Lutang's work are usually profoundly marked by his writings. Let's take a look into the childhood of Sun Lutang. The title of the heading says, Overcoming Injustice with the Brush and the Sword. The early years of Sun Lutang's life are interesting enough to be the subject of a number of movies. Originally named Sun Fu Quan, there is some debate as to when exactly he was born. His daughter says that he was born in 1862 on a small farm outside of Baoding, which is just southwest of Beijing. Sun's father had never been very prosperous and did not marry until middle age. But his father did recognize his son's intelligence, and he sent him to study the Confucian classics with a local teacher when he was just 7 years old. For the next 2 years, Sun Lutang memorized and copied these basic texts. Despite his obvious intelligence, his formal education came to an unceremonious end when his father's crops failed and the family was forced to sell the farm to pay off debts or taxes. A short while later, Sun Lutang's father fell ill and died, leaving the young boy fatherless and with no means of support. Sun Lutang's mother felt that she was unable to care for her child, so she placed him in the home of a wealthy but apparently very sadistic landlord as a servant. Sun was never actually paid for his work, but he was fed. It seems that the virtual slavery did not suit the young child's personality, and while he suffered through many beatings, he started plotting a means of emancipation, at least to the degree that an 8-year-old child can imagine these things. Sun's first break came in 1872. While in a field tending sheep, Sun came across an old man of about 70 years old leading an outdoor Chinese martial arts class. The next day, Sun returned, and he begged to be taught the martial arts. When asked, "Why do you want to study the martial arts?" the naive 11-year-old bluntly told the teacher, whose name was Wu, about his situation and the beatings that he was going through and the desire to take revenge on his employer and his equally abusive family. Astonished at the tale of the young child's life, the older martial artist, Wu, took him on as a student, but only after warning him that the martial arts are not just for fighting. These principles are very deep. It is my hope that we can explore Wu's background and his influence on the young Sun Lutang in a future episode. While a good mentor for the boy, Wu's influence would last years. Then, in 1875, on New Year's Day, Sun Lutang got in a confrontation with the son and nephew of his abusive employer. After successfully defending himself from an unprovoked attack, his boss threatened to beat him to death, and Sun's term of employment as a household servant came to an end. So now, with no means of supporting himself and no plans for the future, Sun Lutang fell into a deep depression. His only interest now laid in the martial arts, but even that was soured by the taunts of the local villagers. They felt that Sun was sure to grow up to become a bandit and a blight on the countryside, and delighted in telling him so. Realistically, statistically, they were speaking the truth. They couldn't have been more correct. Most bandits were young men without prospects or land who suffered an economic setback that forced them out of the village life. So Sun Lutang, not wishing to be a burden on his mother, the young boy resolved to hang himself. Fortunately, his suicide attempt failed, and he was cut down by a passing traveler who took the boy home. After assessing the situation, the man gave the family some money that they used to leave the hamlet and traveled to Baoding proper, where Sun had an uncle who ran a shop selling calligraphy brushes. The uncle took in the struggling family and gave the young Sun Lutang a job as a clerk. This was an immense step up in the life from what he had known in the countryside, and this uncle proved to be a kind employer. Furthermore, his job in town put him in touch with the literary elements of society and gave him a chance to practice his calligraphy on scraps of paper. It was through his uncle that Sun would meet two men that would change his life forever. The first of these individuals was a scholar named Tang. Tang immediately recognized the young boy's talents and invited him into his home to study calligraphy and literature. Tang introduced Sun to a friend whose name, Li Q-yun, was a talented Xingyi student and the owner of the Tai'an Armed Escort Service. Li was delighted to find such a student, and he resumed Sun Lutang's formal instruction in the Chinese martial arts. When he was 18 years old, Sun and Li went to visit Tang on his 50th birthday. Tang took the opportunity to suggest that Li accept Sun as his formal disciple, and Li suggested that Sun should be engaged to Tang's 16-year-old daughter. Both of these ideas were heartily accepted, and Sun's place in society was now secure. But he did not marry immediately. Instead, he and Li traveled to Beijing to study with Gao Yunshin, Li's original Xingyi teacher. So here we are, Sun Lutang's about 18 years old, and the next heading is titled The Wandering Years. By 18 years of age, Sun Lutang's life had changed dramatically. His mother was cared for by Tang. He had a fiancée and the sort of martial education that would allow him to make his way in the world. This was when most young martial artists would settle down and get on to the business of life. But Sun Lutang was reluctant to marry immediately, nor did he only view the martial arts as a means of career advancement. He wanted to understand them on a deeper level, and doing so meant leaving the confines of Baoding and traveling to the capital. Gao Yunshin would be the key figure in his subsequent development into a master. Sun learned quickly as he studied with Gao, and the old master was impressed with the intelligence and the footwork of the youth, enough so that he made him the formal inheritor of his lineage of Kung Fu. He also bequeathed upon him the nickname, Smarter Than an Active Monkey. In total, Sun spent 8 years with Gao. In addition to his earlier martial arts education with Wu and Li, he now had a formidable martial arts education, but he was still not done. In 1889, Sun Lutang used an introduction from Gao to meet Chung Ting Hao, a master of the relatively young Bakwa system. At the age of 27, Sun Lutang undertook a detailed study of this new art. Sun studied with Chung for 3 more years. In that time, he focused on the dragon style of Bakwa, Bakwa sword, and spear training. At the end of this period, he was apparently left with additional questions, but Chung claimed he had no more to teach him. Instead, he said that if Sun wanted to understand the system more deeply, he needed to study Taoism. However, Sun was not free to undertake such a trip lightly. He now had responsibilities to consider. In 1892, he returned to Baoding, married his fiancée, and saw the birth of his first son. To support his family, he started a popular school that attracted a number of students. But this advice from Chung to study Taoism was not forgotten. In around 1894-1895, Sun Lutang set out for Sichuan province, where he met the monk Zhi Jin, who taught him both Yimei Qigong and the theory behind his approach to I Ching analysis. On the return trip, Sun stopped at Wudong Mountain, which is an important site for Taoist instruction. There is where he studied Qigong and the immortality practice with Jing Shu, It's the hope to investigate this philosophical turn in Sun's martial practice and its specific connection to Yimei further along in this podcast. But for right now, we're going to stay more focused on Sun Lutang's timeline, where in 1896 he returned to his hometown near Baoding with his wife and son. During this period, Sun Lutang established not only martial arts classes, but also literary clubs to help spread literacy and basic education among the peasantry. He even appears to have started to lecture about philosophy directly in these classes. While things were going well for Sun and his family, in 1899, we once again find them on the move. This time, Sun moved his whole family away from Baoding and relocated in Xingtang, which was 120 kilometers, or approximately 75 miles from Beijing. That is twice the distance of his previous residence from Beijing. Now that move is usually passed over with relative silence in Sun Lutang's various biographies. And that is unfortunate, as it is probably one of the most interesting and wisest decisions that he made in his entire life. The Boxer Uprising was brewing in 1899, and there was substantial violence along the border between Hebei and Shandong. The spreading violence was clearly headed to Beijing, and Baoding, the place he had just left, was directly in its path. By late 1899, inter-community violence was breaking out between Chinese Christians, who were often armed with modern Western rifles, and the anti-foreign boxers, who were armed with spears and swords in Baoding. The area saw repeated massacres in February and March of 1900 when things began to spiral out of control. Some of the most important violence of the early Boxers' Uprising happened along the Baoding-Beijing Railway to the east of the city. Mr. Joseph Escherwick reviews events in and around Baoding in his groundbreaking study, The Origins of the Boxer Uprising, published in 1987. Most of the boxers were impressionable country youth, rather than sophisticated martial artists. Many of them relied on spirit possession and magical formula for their military power, not years of formal training. Yet and still, it is undeniable that many martial arts schools in the region were caught up in the violence. Others foresaw tragedy on the horizon and tried desperately to distance themselves from the coming cataclysm. It would appear that Sun saw the trouble coming. By moving his family to Shijiazhuang, they avoided the brutal waves of intercommunity violence, and later the Western retaliation that tore Baoding apart. It would be very interesting to know the fate of Sun Lutang's Baoding students from this period, whether they fled or if they stayed to fight. Chengting Hao, Sun's Bakwa teacher that we mentioned earlier, and the individual who sent him on the quest to study Taoism, was shot and killed by German troops during their sack of Beijing. Sun's new home was also far enough from the capital that he could continue to practice and teach the martial arts in the years after the uprising. This is also extraordinarily significant, as schools were being closed and martial artists were forced underground across the country. In this period, public sentiment turned decidedly against all martial artists, and the traditional martial arts came closer to extinction than they had ever been before or since. As a young man, Sun Lutang was very interested in the practical applications of his fighting arts, something that is still reflected in the basic structure of Sun Tai Chi. He fought in a number of challenge matches and worked as a bodyguard and as a guard. However, later in his career, he claimed that the martial arts were really for health maintenance and self-cultivation. He also famously told his students that if they wanted to fight, they should, quote, get a gun, end quote. One wonders how much of this shift in his attitude had to do specifically with his philosophically inspired wandering, and how much of it can be attributed to the utter destruction of Baoding and the murder of his friend and teacher, Chengting Hao, which occurred during the throes of the Boxer Uprising. So now in Sun Lutong's life, he moves on to the national stage. Ben writes, "It is a minor miracle that the traditional modes of hand combat survived the social fallout from the Boxer Uprising. The Western retaliation in the wake of this wave of anti-Christian violence was terrible and indiscriminate. Educated individuals around the country blamed the martial artists, quite unfairly, for this diminished state of their country. Nevertheless, after a few years had passed, it became possible to reopen martial arts schools that were closed in the initial calamity. In 1907, Xu Shijiang, who was still a Qing official, invited Sun to the far northeast of China to set up a martial arts school. While he was there, he defeated a local bandit who was terrorizing the area and may have been scheduled to fight with a foreigner in a public challenge match. Now, the authenticity of this public challenge match isn't confirmed, but the popular story is that Xu Shijiang called the fight off because he feared diplomatic retaliation if Sun defeated this foreigner. This stay in the Northeast did not last long, though it helped to cement his relationship with this state official, Xu, a figure who would be an important politician in the Republic era. It also introduced Sun to a new circle of potential sponsors. Late in 1907, Sun returned to Baoding to reestablish his schools there after almost 8 years of absence. Politics, however, would once again shape Sun's destiny. As you will see in other martial arts biographies, this period before and after the 1911 revolution was an interesting time to be in Beijing. Intellectuals were meeting across the city to discuss different ideas for reform and the future of the country. These dynamic possibilities attracted Sun, who must have bemoaned the diminished state of the martial arts. This is where Sun decided that if he was going to promote the martial arts on a national scale, he needed to be in Beijing. And so he moved his family to a little house in the capital. And as a result, Sun Lutong had a front row seat for many key events in this revolutionary period. In 1914, his daughter, Sun Jinyu, was born. She would go on to become an important teacher of her father's arts and a master in her own right. The same year also saw a chance meeting with Master Hao Wei-Chin, who fell sick while in the capital and was cared for at Sun Lutong's house. Master Hao later repaid Sun by teaching him Wu-style Tai Chi. Sun studied the Tai Chi for 2 years, and this was the last major element of his martial arts education. He was already 52 years old when he undertook the study of Tai Chi Chuan. Kennedy and Gao quite rightly called Sun Lutong the most important writer on the Chinese hand combat. Through his books, he has become probably the most influential martial artist of his generation. His first book, A Study of Xingyi Quan, was released in 1915. This groundbreaking effort was the first really practical modern martial arts manual that could actually teach readers the key points of an art. The text was relatively straightforward and helpful. It was also the first book to contain a large number of photographs documenting every step of a movement or form. Pretty much every martial arts manual published from that point onward has copied Sun's basic format. This early work also turned out to be just the beginning of an ambitious publishing agenda. In 1916, he published a study of 8 trigrams boxing. In 1921, he published a study of Tai Chi boxing. In 1925, he wrote The True Essence of Boxing, which is his most philosophical work. And then in 1927, he released his monograph on the Bakwa sword. The popularity of martial arts instruction started to pick up again in Beijing and around the rest of the country in the mid-1910s. Let's not forget that this is the era when the Jingwu Association came to prominence in Shanghai. Multiple groups were advocating saving the nation through strengthening it, and the traditional martial arts seemed to be an ideal training tool. That same philosophy appears to have appealed to Sun Lutang, and he helped to popularize it. In 1916, Sun joined the Beijing Sports Lecture Hall, which also included luminaries as Wu Jinquan, Yang Chengfu, and Li Jinlin, where Sun taught classes on both the martial arts and Chinese philosophy. The Chinese philosophy was calculated to appeal to a more educated middle-class audience, so this is a clear indication that Sun was attempting to change the demographic profile of the martial arts. A number of reformers during this period concluded that for the martial arts to survive, they had to become more appealing to the educated middle-class individuals. Sun's emphasis on health and self-cultivation was one way of accomplishing this goal. The Jingwu strategy of offering classes on photography or Western sports was another approach. This period of time is also important for the development of the 5 modern styles of Tai Chi, including Sun Lutang's own offering, that combines the essential insights of Tai Chi, Xing Yi, and Bakua. Sun's growing reputation allowed him to rekindle his contacts in government. In 1919, Xu Shizhang, who we mentioned earlier, secured him a government appointment to teach martial arts in the presidential palace. Sun was subsequently assigned the rank of lieutenant in the nationalist military, and he held this position until he formally resigned it in 1924. But it was in 1922, just a couple years before he resigned from the military, that tragedy struck Sun's family. His third son, Sun Hunmin, died of complications from broken ribs after falling and injuring himself in a martial arts demonstration in Shanghai. At that point, Sun moved to Shanghai, which was a growing and dynamic metropolis, and this is where he established new schools with hundreds of students. In 1924, the same year he resigned his military rank, Sun traveled briefly to Shanxi, where he further expanded his student base. He did not stay in this region very long, and he returned to Shanghai to teach in 1928 at the invitation of Zhang Shizhang and Li Qianlin of the Central Guoshu Institute. Sun remained active with the Central Guoshu Institute for some time, receiving appointments in Nanjing and Zhejiang. In 1931, he even opened up a large female class in Zhejiang that he later turned over to his daughter. After the Japanese invasion of the country in 1931, he resigned his various appointments and returned to Beijing. It is in the late November or early December 1933 that Sun began to have premonitions about his impending death. His daughter states that he used his knowledge of the I Ching to predict the exact day and time that he would die. Believing that the end was near, he returned to his home in Baoding. After returning home, he stopped eating and went into a state of almost continual meditation. On the 16th of December, he died in the same room of the same house that he had been born in. So let's summarize where we are. Sun's physical death did little to slow the flow of his ideas. His theories about the martial arts, the value of health and Qigong training, and the intrinsic connection between martial arts and Taoism continued to gain adherents. In fact, Sun's ideas shaped the foundations that the Republican and post-war Chinese martial arts were going to be built upon. They still live on today. While they are the subject of deep study by some martial arts students, they have also generated many popular assumptions about the, quote, traditional arts that are blindly perpetuated by the media and entertainment industry, remembering that these traditional martial arts that they're referring to didn't come about until the 1900s. So far in this review, we have only touched on some of the historical highlights of Sun Lutang's long and eventful career. What is still needed and is coming up is a social history of his contributions to the martial arts, and one that can connect him to the political, social, and martial currents of his day. After all, Sun Lutang's innovations did not happen in a vacuum. He lived in the most dynamic and interesting periods of the martial arts as they were being reformed. And you're going to get a more detailed examination of these issues in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed today's program, where we begin an outline of some of the areas that we're going to be researching and reviewing Sun Lutang's biography and the things that he was influenced by and the things that he impacted a great deal. In today's program, we looked at his first encounter with the martial arts, his suicide attempt after a very brutal childhood, his first encounters with Xing Yi, Bakwa, a scholar who introduced him to Li Kunyong, his first Xing Yi instructor, and then perhaps the most important or intriguing to me was Wu, his first martial arts instructor who he happened to see out there teaching one day in an open area. And the old man told him that the martial arts wasn't just for fighting. It had much deeper principles than that. You followed his fortunate move from the line of fire and then his return to Beijing to start teaching philosophy along with the classes in his martial arts, his self-forecasted death, and in the next episode of Sun Lutang's biography, we're going to be looking at the economics and the social functionality of getting traditional martial arts instruction. Then we're also going to look at Sun Lutang being at the crossroads of modernity. And I want to just emphasize that this time period was extremely difficult. Throughout time, individuals as well as cultures, let's say, will not always embrace change. And China at the time was going through change in almost every aspect that was important to them that you could imagine. Philosophically, even medically, culturally, everything was starting to get influenced by other people, other presences. Martial arts was not going to be left behind. They were either going to have to modern up or go away. Remember that if you ever want to join the 11-day meditational challenge, you can go to simplemeditationalprogram.com. It's free, and I'd love to have you join me. I do it on the first day of each quarter. September the 2nd, I'm going to be at Myrtle Beach doing the Internal Martial Arts Seminar with Troy Price and Paul Cody. We'd love for you to come and visit there. If you want to find out more, go to kungfupodcast.com, Internal Arts. And also, if you want to support this program or get into the newsletter, which I am now outlining ways to inform you of the programs that are going to be up and coming a little bit differently and better than I have in the past, you can go to kungfupodcast.com/support, and I have a list of ways that you can support this program, even if it's just telling a friend, and you can also sign up for the newsletter. Take care of yourself. Have a fantastic practice today, and I look forward to talking with you again next week.